Welcome to the O'Brien Brief. I'm Tony O'Brien. There's a moment in every business owner's life when the question stops being, how do I grow this, and start being, how can I get out of this? Sometimes it's burnout, sometimes it's health, sometimes it's the realization that the next chapter of life shouldn't look like the last one. And when that moment lands, most people don't understand is that selling a business is rarely just a financial transaction. It's an emotional one. It's often a family one, and it's almost always personal. Today, my guest has been on that side of the table with hundreds of owners. Joe Braier runs Lake Country Advisors, a sell-side business brokerage firm operating across Wisconsin and northern Illinois. They specialize in lower middle market companies valued between $1 and $50 million, primarily manufacturing, construction, trades, and medical services. Joe's firm has a 90% listing to sales success rate, which is almost remarkable in this industry. And they've done it through deliberate discipline rather than volume. In fact, Joe and his team turn away about 80% of their business that approaches them. Today, we're going to talk about what actually happens when an owner decides to sell, why valuation conversations are harder than they look, what the buyer market looks like right now, and why Joe thinks Midwest manufacturing is poised for a real comeback. Joe, welcome to the show.
Hi, pleasure to meet you, and really an honor to be here.
Joe, before we get into the work itself, give the audience the short version of how you got here, what's the arc from where you started running Lake Country Advisors today, and what made business brokerage this field where you ended up.
Yeah, that's a good question. It reminds me of, I actually used to teach entrepreneurship at a small university here in Wisconsin, and I would always show the students a visual of what they believe the pathway to success looks like, which they think is just a straight line upwards, compared to what it actually is, which is a massive scribbly line all over the place. And my journey was very much like the latter, that scribbly line kind of going all over the place. When I graduated college, I had that entrepreneurship fire in me, and I decided to jump into real estate. And I opened up my own real estate company, and I started buying properties and flipping properties. And then I started assisting others and selling their properties. And I really enjoyed, the process of helping others. And through my journey of owning my own real estate company, the entire house of cards crashed, obviously, in 2008. And I really had to make a significant adjustment on my real estate business plan. And in doing so, it did make me question a little bit, do I want to just continue with real estate, or should I maybe pivot and start looking to do something else? And it's amazing the way life works, but I just kind of stumbled upon Lake Country Advisors. And I've been selling real estate, and I thought, boy, I never really thought about selling businesses. And I ended up connecting with our founder, who later became my mentor and my partner. And I jumped into the M&A world in late 2008. And it's been one heck of a journey ever since. Since I arrived at Lake Country Advisors, I, really dove in and became a sponge on mergers and acquisitions. I bought into the company in 2013. I got my business valuation certification in 2014. I became the president in 2018. And as of today, I am president and CEO of Lake Country Advisors.
For listeners who don't know the difference between an M&A advisor, business broker, and an investment banker, what does Lake Country sit? And how is what you do different from what most people picture when they hear the words business broker? You're working with companies valued at 1 million to 50 million. You turn away about 80% of the inbound. That's a deliberate posture. Talk about why.
One of the things I think I'm most proud about with Lake Country Advisors, not just myself, it's really our team. I think there are certain levels of when you're doing mergers and acquisitions. And I would say that, on the business brokerage side, there's an opinion that states that the business brokerage world are for individual small businesses, Main Street businesses that are valued at 0 to maybe $1 to $2 million. When you start getting upscale a little bit and going into the larger businesses from that world, you start to enter the higher end of the SBA world, which is basically businesses that are valued at $5 million or less. And then beyond that, we're really entering into the lower middle market. And so when we talk about businesses that are valued from 1 to 50 million, that's our niche. That's the space that we really thrive in and that we play in. And that's the space that, while we are a sell side representation company, we've got thousands and thousands of buyers that have contacted us, and they're all looking for opportunities that fall within this space. Once you get above kind of the $50 million mark, you're starting to go more towards investment banking. And, all three categories are fantastic. It's just a matter of the overall size and the space of which each are playing in.
Yeah, you told me that the number one reason owners come to you wanting to sell is burnout, not financial necessity, not strategic timing. Burnout. Walk the audience through what that looks like in real terms. When an owner sits down with you for the first time, what are you actually hearing underneath the words they're using?
Yeah, I think, burnout is probably the number one reason why sellers are coming to us. There are others. I'll just quickly hit on a few. Sometimes we come up with a partnership dispute. The partners have maybe they're still great friends, but their overall direction is going in separate ways. Another one could be health issues, right? Maybe it's the health issue of the owner, or maybe it's a family member, a spouse, perhaps. So there's all kinds of reasons why business owners are thinking about selling. And of course, there are some that actually do plan and strategize and really hit their timing appropriately. But yeah, to go back to your question, and what I would consider maybe the number one answer is the burnout. And that's, I think, the burnout is becoming more and more prominent because, we're in the midst of the baby boomer generation beginning to finally hit the shorelines of retirement. And, there's so many positive attributes with the baby boomer generation, one of which is that they're very much workaholics. You really have to admire how hard they work, the amount of blood, sweat, and tears that they've really poured into their business. And quite frankly, I think because of that hard work mentality, their DNA is embedded into the business. And, there just comes a time where all entrepreneurial journeys do come to an end. And so I think that there's a number of reasons why the baby boomer generation are holding on a little bit longer. I feel like 75 is somewhat the new 65 to a degree. But, at the same time, I would also say that I think there are many that are understanding that business is not the end all be all to life. And I'm starting to see more and more step forward and say, you know what, we've had a great run, but it's time to really go and enjoy life. Let's go and enjoy, the accomplishments that we've achieved over the years. And I just think maybe now is the right time to sell a business. However, I've never done this before. I really need some help, and I just don't know where to begin. That's typically what I'm hearing, and that's totally okay. I mean, that's why we are here. We are here to guide our sellers and sit down with them, put together a structured, customized exit strategy to make sure we're really accomplishing all of the goals and objectives that they're looking to accomplish.
Yeah, you mentioned family run. Sometimes it's a second or third generation families that are selling their business. For those owners, the isn't just a balance sheet, is it? It's identity, legacy, employees they've known for 20 plus years, sometimes a building their grandfather built. How do you guide an owner through the emotional side of letting go of something like this? What's the conversation you have that no other advisor is having with them?
It's really just a matter of sitting down and really understanding what's really important to them. Do we have family members that are still in the business? If so, are there pathways that we could get the family members to achieve ownership? Ownership can come in a wide variety of ways. And so, if it's if it's still important to pass it on to a family member, we really sit down and see what strategies could we implement to be able to still achieve keeping it within the family. However, I would say that there are a good majority of business owners that, like you said, are second, third, sometimes even fourth generational owners within the family, and their children have just decided to go elsewhere or do something different, and now they don't have someone to take on the family business. Well, the legacy aspect is still incredibly critical and important, and so we really begin to sit down and go through the psychology of what is important on what we need to look for in a buyer. And, I've had stories where I've had sellers turn down 100% all cash offers because it's not the right fit. It's not the right buyer. Price is in terms and structure of the deal. Of course, for just about everyone, that's important. That's a no-brainer, but it's the secondary, it's the qualitative aspects of who is a buyer, what's their background, what's their experience, what's their vision moving forward with the company. Those are the things that we find are very critical in this lower middle market, because there is that legacy situation at play, and they want to make sure that that legacy is 100% protected. And so by understanding what that is and what they're really looking for, we can then implement that into our customized exit strategy to really help them achieve the type of buyer that they're really looking for.
Would you say legacy is the biggest reason for failure on a sale?
How do you mean?
Well, you mentioned some very important points. Long-term longevity, they were lifetime in business. New guy coming in doesn't see the same legacy that the seller sees, has a different vision for the direction of the company, a different legacy for the company. Does that impact the sale?
It can, if it's not discovered up front. I think, again, that's why I think that's really what is part of what separates us maybe from the rest, is that we really take our time to sit down and really understand the psychological aspects that are important to legacy and moving forward and finding the right buyer. If we're not doing our due diligence upfront on buyers and pre-qualification and really understanding what that vision is of a buyer, that's where you're correct. You could get trapped, and then your deal is going to fall apart, because in the end, the seller is going to end up getting uncomfortable once they begin to foresee what the buyer's agenda is going to be with the business moving forward. So it's just incredibly critical to talk about that kind of stuff up front and make sure that the right connection, the right fit is established. And we really understand, what are the aspects, the ethical values that the business owner is looking for the business to carry forward. And then we make sure that, the buyer is sharing that same vision.
Do the employees become a big part of the conversation?
Yeah, and employees are always tricky because everything we do is very confidential. So a lot of business owners, they're a little nervous about informing the employees, and quite honestly, in order to do things the correct way, which a lot of business owners get somewhat uncomfortable with. But this has to remain confidential. Employees cannot know that the business is for sale. Just like competition shouldn't know the business is for sale. Just like vendors shouldn't know the business is for sale, nor should the customers know that the business is for sale. So everything that we do is 100% confidential. And, that's where our secret sauce comes into play, where we can create awareness about the opportunity without letting anyone know what the opportunity actually is. I mean, how do you take this thing to the open market without giving away the business name or the location or anything like that, right? So, but that's where we thrive, and that's where we excel. As far as the employees go, we don't want the employees getting the wrong impression that the new owner is going to come in and start letting everyone go. In the small business world, it's quite the contrary. In fact, when small businesses transfer, human capital is actually an incredible qualitative asset that is part of the business. The buyers don't want the employees to leave. And so you really have to follow a very proven process to make sure that we inform the employees at the appropriate time. And it's a very delicate balance, because we're trying to make sure that the buyer is comfortable. And at the same time, we're really trying to protect the overall value of the business and make sure that there are no disruptions to day to day operations.
Talk about valuation for a moment. You said that convincing sellers on realistic valuations is one of the hardest conversations you have, often because their accounting or attorneys have given them numbers that emotionally satisfy but commercially unsupportable. How do you bring an owner back to reality on price without breaking the relationship? And what are the valuation methods you actually use? Debt service, coverage ratios, multiples, asset based, that produce defensible numbers or not?
Yeah, in the small business world, a lot of transactions are with the use of a bank and financing the overall deal in some kind of capacity. Now, that's not always the case, but a good majority, whether it's maybe a business or an individual that's going to go out, maybe if you're private equity, you're coming in with your own funds and bank financing doesn't come into play as much, right? So you're going to have, I think step one is making sure that the business owner understands that valuation is both art and science. The science aspect is really the methodology behind the valuation. It's number crunching. It's doing financial analysis. It's taking a look at historical financials to be able to predict what future cash flow of the operation is going to be. And that's the way that the majority of not only the buyers, but the bank's underwriters are really going to take into consideration. And so our approach is we'll conduct multiple valuation methodologies to apply, whether that's a multiple on adjusted EBITDA or if it's a debt service coverage ratio analysis of how the banks would be looking at it after appropriate down payments and any other expenses might come into play. So we really try to tackle it from a wide variety of different scenarios. And then we sit down with the business owner and we show our homework. And by being able to do a lot of that upfront with the seller to make sure that we're all on the same page, I think it's incredibly valuable, because the last thing we want to do is enter into a long-term relationship with a potential seller where our price point is just unachievable. That's a relationship that's going to crash and burn. And we just make sure to avoid, entering into those circumstances.
You surprised me with the conversation we had initially. Typically, a sale at Lake Country takes about 9 months, right? A month of preparation, uncertain buyer identification phases in the middle, about 3 months, and then due diligence and closing. The middle phase is where the time really lives, right? Finding the right buyer for a specific business. Walk us through what happened during those middle months and why finding the right buyer is harder than people expect.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, especially when you start getting down into the nitty gritty of not just who's going to be able to come to a mutual agreement on our price, but also who is that right fit? What are the qualities and characteristics of what we're looking for in a buyer, right? And so your topic of timing is really important, I think, for business owners to understand, because when they start thinking about, what, especially if they're burned out, I think enough is enough. I think it's time for me to pass the baton over to someone else and begin my exit strategy planning. Well, when they're ready to go, like you said, it's still a 9 month, sometimes a full year process. And that's just to get the deal across the finish line. Then post closing, we're going to be dealing with what's called a transition service agreement, which we help negotiate. But the seller is going to really need to stick around, really be a mentor, show day-to-day operations, and that could be for an additional 2 to 3 months to possibly up to a year. And sometimes when private equity is involved, it's longer than a year. And so again, that's the kind of stuff that we discuss with the seller up front so that we know what they're looking to do for a transition, and we try to negotiate it to the time frame that they're looking for. We also try to find the right buyer that's going to be willing to accept that transition period. But as far as the 9 month period of from the time we take it to the open market to the time we actually close, like you said, that first month or so is just packaging the business, getting it ready to fully launch. Once we launch, yeah, it's marketing the business confidentially. Then it's fielding calls and making calls to tons and tons and tons of buyers. It's introducing them to the opportunity without giving away the name or location, seeing what kind of level of interest that they might have on this specific industry with this rough geographic region, and really doing pre-qualification, collecting non-disclosures, and then slowly introducing the business to the buyer and seeing just what level of interest they actually have, right? And so again, there's a very proven chronological process of the way we unfold information to a buyer, but it becomes a full-time job. And so that's why we're here. I mean, Lake Country Advisors, we've got not only myself, but 12 other M&A agents, 3 admin people. And so when our sellers are working with us, they're getting a full team of support behind them for their exit strategy.
On a typical deal, how many buyers step to the plate on a particular deal? Obviously, the larger the deal, the fewer the buyers. But what's the average? And then you've got to weed through all these buyers and eliminate the ones that won't qualify and hang on to the ones that will. That's got to be very complicated.
Yeah, I don't know that there really is an exact average. And that's just because certain industries are very hot. Certain industries will require, higher demand just because of the industry trends of which are being currently experienced. I think right now, we represent businesses both in Wisconsin and Illinois. And we're seeing very hot trends in manufacturing, the trades, construction, whether it's HVAC, plumbing, electrical contracting, so we could easily get well over 100 inquiries probably within the first month or two. And it is a lot of follow-up with all of those buyers and trying to get them to get to the next phase of the process. But, right now for sellers, it's a crazy market. It's very much a seller's market versus a buyer's market. And I just think it's because of the sheer volume of supply demand. The demand is very high. There's tons and tons of buyers out there. The supply is picking up, but it's still nowhere close to the amount of buyers that are currently out there. And so from our experience, especially over the last 12, 24 months, we've really seen when we bring a good quality cash flowing company to the open market, we really achieve a high volume of buyers that are inquiring that we need to go through and really just figure out, who's going to put together the best deal that has the right personality and characteristics that are really going to carry the legacy of the seller moving forward.
From your point of view, what do you think is driving this huge demand, especially in the Midwest, for these types of businesses?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a lot of people think entrepreneurship is sexy. And I think that is really driven a lot of corporate America individuals that are leaving corporate America. When you start taking a look at the different types of buyers that are out there, one category is first time buyers, even in the lower middle market. They're probably going to be on the upper echelon of the SBA world or in the very bottom part of the lower middle market. But these individuals have got really good experience. They've saved up their funds. Maybe some of them are going to actually use their 401k funds, which there are programs out there to utilize your 401k, open up a C Corp, transition your 401k into your C Corp, and that's tax-free, penalty-free, and then use that for your down payment to go buy a business, right? So there are programs out there that are like that. And I think that a lot of people that have climbed the ladder in corporate America, they begin to realize, you know what? I think it's time for me to just break off and build something on my own. And we're seeing more and more of that. So that's a big driving factor. I think the other driving factor is companies are always looking to grow and expand, and acquisition is always a good way to do that. And then I would also say that private equity has really skyrocketed over the last 20 years, and more private equity groups are being formed, and we're seeing a lot of activity coming out from investment groups.
If a listener today listening to this podcast, they're running a 5, 10, $20 million business today, and they're starting to feel that pull, the burnout, the next chapter question, the wondering whether it's time question. What's the one piece of advice you'd give them about what to do first? what not, not to do with the sale, but what to do now, 18 months or 2 years before they're actually going to market?
Number one, form your team. I always say there's the core four. You should have your M&A advisor, like Lake Country Advisors, but then you also need to make sure that you're having discussions with your accountant. You need to have an attorney, and let me emphasize an M&A attorney, because you can have attorneys that are very good at what they do, but if they're not specialized in mergers and acquisitions, it's in the seller's best interest to get aligned with someone that really knows M&A and has that experience. And then the third category, or the fourth individual, would be their financial planner. I think collectively, we are constantly working with the seller's accountant, attorney, and financial planner to make sure that all aspects are really covered. Another big thing that I like to say is, failing to plan is planning to fail. And so you really got to have a plan in place. And so once the team is organized, then we sit down and we have those initial discussions. We go through valuation and really start charting the pathway moving forward, and taking into consideration the financial goals as well as the legacy goals of which we want to implement into that customized exit strategy, and then make the decision, is now the right time? Or maybe it's in 6 months to a year, or maybe we kick the can down a little bit further. Maybe there's some improvement that needs to be done to the business. And so we want to do what's in the best interest of the seller, which ends up being our client. And I think that that's why we look at ourselves as more of an advisory role than anything else, because not only myself, but others here at Lake Country Advisors, we're all entrepreneurs. We understand the dedication and grind that's required to run and operate these businesses. And so, we want them to be treated the way that we would be treated in our own entrepreneurial journey. And I think having that journey really adds some benefit for us, because we have a much better, deeper level of understanding of what not only sellers are going through, but buyers too.
One of the complexities of your deals could be the real estate. We really didn't touch on that. Big business operation, but maybe they're leasing the space, or maybe they own the operation, they own the real estate. Then they do want to sell, or they want to hold on to the real estate. Does that run into a lot of problems for you when you're trying to put a deal together?
For us, it doesn't. A lot of us here at Lake Country Advisors, we're real estate investors. We know the real estate market. It's by law that we need to have our real estate license. So we're all licensed in the states that we are representing businesses in. So we can also put on our realtor hat and have that, be included as part of the transaction. I guess I would say, for those advisors that are working with other M&A groups, my biggest advice is maybe your core four needs to improve to five, because if your M&A advisor doesn't have their real estate license, then you're going to have to pull in probably a commercial realtor. There's the saying of, you don't want to have too many cooks in the kitchen, right? And so I think that just gives us another advantage of just having that knowledge of the real estate market.
Has the real estate side of the business ever created a transaction, or do you usually try to find a solution to get around those issues?
Yeah, it's definitely more the solution. I mean, the last thing that I would give up as an owner would be my building before I sell the business. I think the vast majority of buyers out there, they want the real estate. Now, there are some that don't. They would prefer to rent the real estate. And so, I think as we sit down with sellers, that's part of our discovery day, and really understanding what the true goals and objectives are of the seller. What is it that you want to do with the real estate? Whatever it is that our sellers want to do with the real estate, that is part of our exit strategy. And then we just got to go find the right buyer that's willing and able to agree to that portion of what we're looking to do. Some sellers, they want to be done 100%, and they don't want to be the landlord of the property. However, I've run into some sellers that have said, you know what, I really like my real estate, and that could be additional mail money coming in on a monthly basis for me. Why don't I keep the real estate? I'd rather lease it. Okay, well, then we're going to go to market. And when we get to the appropriate timing with the the buyer, this is the exit strategy my client is looking for. We're looking to sell the business, but lease the real estate. And then we just got to find the right buyer that's willing to do so.
Right. Yeah, I can imagine that can run into problems at times, or make it much easier to do the transaction for.
Again, in this kind of market, with the amount of buyers that are stepping forward and showing strong interest, it hasn't been as challenging, quite honestly, because there's just the sheer volume of buyers. And when we really understand what the true goals and objectives are of the seller, we can really find the right buyer that's going to match and create that synergy between buyer and seller.
So, in your experience, what's the one thing owners most underestimate about selling their business? The thing that 9 out of 10 times catches them by complete surprise.
Well, I would say number one is the timing, but we talked about that, so I'll go to number two. But just real quick again on that timing, you almost, if you want to be done, you almost need to start the process. I'm going to say about a year and a half to 2 years from the time that you really, really, really want to be 100% done, because again, you're talking on average of a 9-month timeline to be able to take the business to the market, find the right buyer, and close on the transaction. That's on average. Sometimes that can go a year or a little bit longer. But then when the transaction does come to a conclusion, again, you're going to have to stick around for a transition period, which could be another 3 months to potentially a year, and sometimes even longer. And so, timing is by far the number one. I would say the second thing, just to, elaborate on another answer, would be due diligence. I find that both on buy side, sometimes buy side doesn't understand what the seller's viewpoint is on things, and I think sometimes the sellers don't understand what the buyer's viewpoint is on things. And so from when a buyer steps forward, they sign the non-disclosure, they start being introduced to the business, they want to see information on the actual business itself. And we always say we kind of break that up into two separate categories. It's pre-LOI. So what kind of information is the buyer going to receive prior to making an offer for them to make an informed decision if this is something that they want to submit a letter of intent on? But then when the letter of intent is submitted and mutually agreed to, then there's post-LOI due diligence. Now we're working with the one buyer, and they're going to provide us with a list of due diligence documentation requests that the seller has to work on gathering. And of course, Lake Country Advisors helps and tries to assist in any way possible. But we are working hand in hand with the seller on that collection of information. I think sellers got to understand, if the buyer is going to come and buy your vehicle, your business, they're absolutely going to want to pop the hood and inspect the engine, because the number one threat to buyers is the fear of the unknown. They don't know what they don't know. And so they are going to try to uncover every single thing that they possibly can think about as far as the business and the business operation, to make sure that there's no skeletons in the closet they haven't been informed about. And so when we work with sellers, it's my goal and objective to be as transparent as possible, because if a seller tries to carry forward any kind of secrets, they're always going to get exposed, and in the end our sellers get hurt. And so we have that kind of upfront discussion, mutual understanding, before we proceed and move forward with a seller.
You meant pre and post LOI. The buyer doesn't know who they're talking about when you first get connected with them. They just know about a business, but they don't know a name. They don't know anything really until they get to the post, say, oh my God, that's the company. That's when they really get the first glimpse at who they're trying to buy. Is that correct?
Well, again, I think from our creative marketing and the type of technology that we're using to create awareness of opportunities without letting anyone know what the opportunity is, that buyer will come forward. And again, we need to pre-qualify. We need a non-disclosure agreement. But once we get that non-disclosure agreement in place, then it's a slow roll of introduction of information about the business. So while we're protecting the business and the seller, we got to have the buyer follow that methodical process. It's very chronological in the way that information is distributed to them. So I think by the time that they reach the point of being able to write a letter of intent, yeah, they absolutely know the name of the business, the location. They've received what's called an offering memorandum, or some people call it the SIM, confidential information memorandum. And they're then exposed to a certain level of information from financials and other important information that, again, these buyers need to be able to analyze from a valuation standpoint so that they can conduct their own valuation and submit their letter of intent. But there's going to be certain information that is withheld and not shared to just every single buyer that's kicking tires and seeing if this is the right opportunity for them. All of that information is more the deep dive that takes place post letter of intent.
So last question. You sat across from a lot of owners at one of the most consequential moments of their professional lives. What's the lesson from that work that informs you how you live your own life or run your own firm that wish you had known when you had started all of this?
That's a great question. I would say, I think it took us a while to really identify our overall mission. And there's a lot of different themes that we carry forward here at Lake Country Advisors. But I think one of the best ones is entrepreneurs helping other entrepreneurs. We're local, we are very experienced, and we're trusted, but it is really the ability to put yourself in the shoes of the entrepreneur. And because we've been through it ourselves with our own journeys and our own businesses that are outside of Lake Country Advisors, it really gives us a different perspective. I've bought a business, I've sold a business that's outside of Lake Country Advisors. When I was buying the business, it was very much fear of the unknown. And that perspective really gives us agents here at Lake Country Advisors the ability to relate to buyers and really have the right perspective of what they're looking to achieve, but also the overall excitement in managing that excitement, because they're about to embark on this incredible entrepreneurial journey. And while it's exciting, it can be scary for some at times. And so just having that psychological experience of going through it ourselves, we can really adapt and relate to the buy side, but equally on the sell side. When I sold, I owned a sports academy business where we were training high school and college athletes in baseball and football and track and high speed performance and stuff like that. And I really, really enjoyed that business. But when I sold that business, I was excited because I knew I found the right buyer. It was definitely the right fit. But you know what? The buyer had some of their own ideas. And as I passed that baton over to them, they implemented those ideas. And as the legacy, I think, continues because, the core ethics that we all had envisioned are still there. But it's just an emotional roller coaster ride for the sell side to really go through with it and see the changes take place. But at the end of the day, I'm incredibly at peace with my decision. And it's that mindset of being at peace that I really want to achieve for all the business owners that are out there. And that comes back to the very beginning when we first sit down with them and we take out our pad and start sketching out what that customized exit strategy actually looks like.
Joe, this has been a fabulous conversation. For listeners who want to learn more about Lake Country Advisors, we'll include a link to the firm in the show notes. Joe, thank you for the time today. It's been informative. It's really been enjoyable. To the audience, if you got value out of this one, share it with business owners who's thinking about the next chapter. They'll thank you for it. We'll be back next week with another guest building serious things. Until then, I'm Tony O'Brien. Thank you for listening to the O'Brien Brief.